Commander Scythera could see that much from the bridge of her flagship, the Thornmantle, as it drifted through the debris field like a predator circling a carcass. The wreckage of the alien vessel stretched across thousands of kilometers, torn apart by weapons fire that had never been meant for it. The colony ship had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time, caught between Drelith and Voss guns during a skirmish that neither side would even remember in a year. Scythera clicked her mandibles in irritation. She had not come here for this. Her salvage fleet had been dispatched to recover Drelith military hardware lost in the battle, not to pick through the bones of some unknown species' broken dream. But orders were orders, and anything of value was to be catalogued and claimed. "Spread out," she commanded, her voice carrying the sharp resonance of a Drelith officer who had never once needed to repeat herself. "Take what is useful, and leave the rest to the—" Her crew obeyed without question. Dozens of salvage teams in armored shuttles fanned out across the debris field, cutting into shattered hull sections with plasma torches and dragging out whatever they could find. Most of it was worthless by Drelith standards. The unknown species had built their ship from primitive alloys and soft metals, the kind of materials the hegemony had abandoned centuries ago. Their technology was laughable. Their weapon systems, what little remained of them, were barely capable of scratching Drelith chitin. Scythera reviewed the reports from her command chair and felt nothing but contempt. Whatever species had built this vessel, they were clearly bottom feeders of the galaxy, scraping along with crude tools and fragile bodies. They had ventured into space, and space had killed them, as it should. It was Junior Salvage Officer Corvith who changed everything. Corvith was young by Drelith standards, barely past his third molting, still carried the eager curiosity that older warriors had long since beaten out of themselves. He had been assigned to sweep the lower decks of the largest hull fragment, a section that the initial scans had flagged as containing possible biological storage units. He expected to find preserved food supplies, or perhaps genetic samples from alien livestock. What he found instead was a cryopod. It was small, much smaller than anything a Drelith would use, and it was wedged beneath a collapsed support beam in what appeared to have been a nursery. The walls around it were scorched black, and the ceiling had caved in, but the pod itself was intact, powered by a backup battery that had somehow survived the destruction. Frost covered its tiny window, and a faint blue light pulsed from its control panel, steady as a heartbeat. Corvith brushed the frost away and looked inside. A face looked back at him. It was small, and round and soft, with skin that seemed impossibly thin and fragile. Two closed eyes sat above a tiny nose, and a mouth that trembled even in cryosleep. The creature could not have been more than 4 solar cycles old by any reasonable estimation. It had no chitin, no armor plating, no visible natural weapons of any kind. It was wrapped in a soft cloth that seemed designed for warmth rather than protection. Corvith had never seen anything so vulnerable in his entire life. He activated his communicator. "Commander, I have found something." Scythera arrived 12 minutes later with Thesic, her chief science officer, and a squad of armed guards. She stared at the cryopod with her compound eyes and said nothing for a long time. "Open it," she finally ordered. Thesic interfaced with the pod's primitive computer system and initiated the revival sequence. The lid hissed open, and warm air rushed out, carrying with it a scent that made every Drelith in the room instinctively recoil. It was the smell of living flesh, raw and unprotected, without the mineral tang of chitin or the chemical signature of natural armor. It smelled like prey. The child's eyes opened. They were brown, the color of dark soil, and for one perfect moment they held nothing but confusion. Then the child saw the towering insectoid figures standing over her, their crystalline exoskeletons gleaming in the harsh salvage lights, their compound eyes reflecting her tiny face 100 times over. She screamed. The sound was extraordinary. Fesik's instruments spiked across every frequency as the child's vocal cords produced a wail of pure terror that echoed through the dead ship's corridors. Several guards actually stepped back, not from fear, but from sheer sensory overload. The child thrashed and kicked and clawed at the air, with hands that had soft, blunt fingers instead of proper talons. "Silence it," Cythera snapped. A medic stepped forward and reached for the child. She bit him. Her teeth were small and dull, flat, and should not have been able to do anything at all to Drelith Chitin. But she found the soft joint between his wrist plates and clamped down with desperate fury. The medic yelped and pulled back, more startled than hurt, and the child retreated to the far corner of her pod, shaking and snarling like a cornered animal. Fesik ran his scanners over her with clinical detachment. "The specimen is female," he announced. "Approximately 4 standard cycles of age. Carbon-based biology, oxygen-dependent, water-rich cellular structure." He paused, and his antennae twitched. "Commander, this creature's bones are remarkably fragile. Its skin has almost no natural resistance. Its healing factor is extremely slow compared to any known sentient species." He looked up from his instruments with something close to disbelief. "By every biological metric I can measure, this species should not have survived past the evolutionary cradle. It is quite simply a mistake." "Mandibles. Then dispose of it, and let us move on." "No." Every head turned to Corvith. He stood rigid, his young chitin flushed dark with the effort of defying his commander, but his voice did not waver. "I invoke the right of found burden," he said. Silence fell. The right was ancient, older than the hegemony itself. It stated that any warrior who discovered a helpless being in the aftermath of battle was obligated to shelter that being until it could survive on its own. It was a relic of a more honorable age, almost never invoked in modern times, but it was still law. Cythara stared at Corvith for a very long time. "You would bind yourself to this creature," she said quietly. "This soft, screaming, biting little thing that my science officer has just told me is an evolutionary accident." "The right does not ask me to judge the creature's worth," Corvith replied, "only to protect its life." Cythara wanted to refuse. She wanted to overrule him, to toss the creature back into the void where it belonged. But the right was the right, and she had not risen to her rank by breaking sacred law. "So be it," she said coldly. "It is your burden, Corvith. You will feed it, house it, and keep it out of my way. It will be designated Specimen 11C, and it will be confined to your quarters." She turned and walked away, her heavy legs cracking against the metal floor. "And if it dies, which it will, you will dispose of it yourself." They brought the child aboard the Thornmantle that evening. She was placed in a small containment unit in Corvith's quarters, and given water and nutrient paste that Fesik had synthesized based on her biological readings. She refused to eat. She refused to sleep. She sat in the corner of her containment unit and cried for hours, a sound that carried through the walls and down the corridors and kept half the deck awake. Corvith sat outside the unit and listened and did not know what to do. Deep hours of the ship's night cycle, the crying stopped. Corvith looked through the transparent wall. The child was staring at him. Her eyes were red and swollen, and her tiny body still shook with the aftershocks of her grief. But she was not afraid anymore. He could see that clearly, even through the alien features he did not yet understand. She was angry. She bared her small flat teeth at him and growled, a sound so absurdly unthreatening from a creature her size that it should have been laughable. But Corvith did not laugh, because in that moment, Fesik's voice crackled over the internal comm. "Corvith, are you observing the specimen?" "Yes." "I am reading her biosigns remotely. Her heart rate just doubled. Her adrenal glands are flooding her system with combat chemicals." A pause. She is not frightened, Corvith. She is not grieving anymore either. Corvith watched the tiny creature glare at him with all the fury her small body could contain. She then, he asked. Thessic's answer came slowly, as though even he could not quite believe his own instruments. She is angry. And Corvith, I do not think she knows how to stop. The child was still small. She was still soft. She still bled when she fell, and bruised when she bumped into the hard edges of a ship that had never been designed for anything as fragile as her. She was still, by every Draelith standard of measurement, the weakest living thing aboard the Thornmantle. But she was no longer crying. The crew had taken to calling her 11, after her specimen designation, because none of them could pronounce whatever sounds her species used for names. She answered to it with the casual indifference of a creature that had decided names were the least of her problems. She had bigger things to worry about, like learning how to survive in a world full of giants who thought she was worthless. And she was learning fast. That was the first thing that unsettled Thessic. He had expected the child to remain essentially nonverbal for years. Draelith children took 3 to 4 cycles to master basic language, and that was with the advantage of being surrounded by their own kind. 11 had no such advantage. She was immersed in a language that used clicks and resonance tones that her soft throat was never meant to produce. She learned it anyway. Within 2 months she could understand simple commands. Within 4, she was stringing together broken sentences that made the linguists on board deeply uncomfortable. Within 6, she was fluent enough to argue, to demand things, to ask questions that no one wanted to answer, and to swear with a creativity that the engineering crew took full credit for. Where did she learn that word? Corvith demanded one morning, after 11 called a maintenance drone something so vulgar that 3 passing officers stopped walking. Chief Engineer Harral shrugged all 4 of his shoulders. She watches everything. That was the second thing that unsettled everyone. 11 watched. She watched constantly, and with an intensity that seemed wrong for a creature her age. Tracked movement across rooms, followed patterns, noted details. The Draelith were not a careless species, but they had built their ship's security around the assumption that its inhabitants were Draelith. They had not accounted for a 4-year-old alien who could fit into spaces they could not, who memorized door codes by watching officers input them from across corridors, and who apparently never forgot anything she saw. She escaped her quarters 11 times in the first 2 months. The first 3 times caused panic. The 4th through 7th caused irritation. By the 8th escape, Corvith simply found her sitting in the mess hall, eating stolen rations, and staring at a group of warriors who were playing a strategy game she had never been taught. She was watching their moves, and Corvith noticed with a cold feeling in his thorax that her eyes were not confused. They were calculating. She has memorized the rules, Thessic said when Corvith reported it. Watching them play for approximately 6 hours over the past week, and she now understands the fundamental strategy. He paused. Corvith, most Draelith adolescents require formal instruction to learn that game. She taught herself by observation alone, and she is 4 years old. But it was the physical adaptation that truly frightened the science team. The Thornmantle had not been built for humans. The gravity was 30% stronger than whatever 11 species had evolved in. The atmosphere had a different gas ratio. The temperature was kept at levels that should have been uncomfortable for her soft, thin-skinned body. By all rights, she should have been struggling, weakening, slowly declining in this hostile environment. Instead, she adapted. Her small legs, shaky and uncertain in the first weeks, grew steady and then strong. The muscles in her body thickened visibly as they compensated for the extra gravity. Her breathing deepened and slowed as her lungs learned to extract what they needed from air that was not quite right for them. Thessic measured her respiratory efficiency every week, and every week the numbers improved. This should not be possible, he muttered over his instruments one evening. The organism is physically restructuring itself to match its environment. Not through any conscious effort, but through automatic biological response. He looked at Corvith, with an expression that on a Draelith face passed for genuine alarm. Her species does not evolve to fit one world, Corvith. They evolve to fit any world. This is not adaptation. It is something else entirely. I do not have a word for what this is. Corvith did not have a word for it either, but he saw it every day. He saw it when 11 fell and immediately stood up again, bleeding from her soft knees, and continued doing whatever she had been doing as though the pain did not matter. He saw it when she burned her hand on a steam pipe, and instead of retreating, she examined the pipe, learned where the hot sections were, and never touched one again. He saw it when the ship's gravity generator malfunctioned and spiked to nearly double normal levels for 30 seconds, an event that left 2 Draelith soldiers dizzy and disoriented, and 11 simply dropped to her knees, rode it out, and then stood up and asked what happened. She fell down more than any creature Corvith had ever seen. She also got up more than any creature he had ever seen, and she got up faster every time. Then there was the matter of what Thesic delicately called her social engineering capabilities. 11 had figured out the crew. Not just their names and ranks, but their personalities, their weaknesses, their soft spots. She knew that Corvith could not resist her when she was quiet and sad. She knew that Heral the engineer would give her extra food if she watched him work with wide, fascinated eyes. She knew that the weapons officer Kryn would let her into restricted areas, demonstrated knowledge of combat systems because Kryn respected competence above all else. She played them, not with malice, but with the effortless instinct of a species that had apparently evolved social manipulation as a core survival trait. She was 4 years old, and she was managing a crew of alien warriors like a conductor managing an orchestra. And most of them did not even realize it was happening. Commander Sithara realized. She had been watching 11 too, from a distance, through security feeds and crew reports. She had expected the creature to die within weeks. Instead, it was thriving, and not just surviving, but actively reshaping its environment to suit its needs, bending the behavior of hardened Draelith warriors through nothing more than observation and instinct. Sithara summoned Thesic to her quarters. "Tell me what we are dealing with," she said. Thesic placed his research files on her desk. 6 months of data, biological readings, behavioral analysis, cognitive assessments. The data told a story that grew more alarming with every page. "The child is extraordinary," Thesic said. "Not because she is strong, she is not. Not because she is fast, or armored, or venomous. She is none of those things. She is extraordinary because she is none of those things, and yet she refuses to fail." He clicked his mandibles nervously. "Commander, her species has no natural weapons, no armor, no venom, no significant speed or strength advantage over comparable predators. And yet they built a starship. That colony vessel we found was crude by our standards, but it was functional, and it carried thousands of them across interstellar distances." "Your point," Sithara said. "My point is that this child is 4 years old, and she has already adapted to an alien environment, learned an alien language, memorized our security protocols, and manipulated trained warriors into serving her needs." Thesic leaned forward. "What are the adults like? Commander, what happens when this species has had decades to learn and adapt and plan? What are we going to find if we ever meet them in numbers?" Sithara said nothing. She stared at the data, and the data stared back, and neither of them blinked. 3 days later, a distress signal came in. The Draelith colony of Keth Vorun was under attack by Voss raiders, and the garrison was being overwhelmed. The Thornmantle was the closest warship. Sithara ordered an immediate course change, and the ship hummed with the sudden energy of warriors preparing for battle. Corvith suited up in his combat armor and checked his weapons. He was halfway to the shuttle bay when he felt a tug on his leg. 11 stood behind him. She had escaped her quarters again, because of course she had. Her brown eyes were fixed on the warriors marching past, on the weapons being loaded, on the shuttles powering up. She had seen enough of Drelith life to understand exactly what was happening. Said in her broken but clear Drelith, "I fight too." Corvith looked down at her. 4 years old, 15 kilograms of soft skin and brittle bone, and relentless burning fury, packed into a body that any Voss warrior could crush with one hand. She was completely serious. He knelt down until his compound eyes were level with her small, fierce face. "You cannot fight," he said gently. "You are too small." She looked at him with an expression he had come to know very well over the past 6 months. It was the expression she wore right before she did something that everyone told her she could not do. "Watch me," she said. Mara could see the fires from the shuttle bay viewport, orange and red blooming across the surface of the mining colony, like wounds opening on dark skin. The Voss had hit the settlement hard and fast, their dropships punching through the orbital defenses before the garrison could mount a proper response. Now, Drelith soldiers were dying on the ground, and the Thornmantle had arrived just in time to watch it happen. She was not supposed to be here. Corvith had locked her in his quarters before deploying with the ground assault team. He had used the new security code, the one he changed specifically because she had cracked the last 3. She cracked this one in 4 minutes. It was not even a good code. She made her way through the ship on bare feet, small enough to slip past distracted crew members who were too focused on battle preparations to notice one tiny alien moving through the corridors. She had memorized the ship's layout months ago, and she knew exactly where the wounded would be brought. The medical bay on Deck 7, the largest open space on the ship, with direct shuttle access through the cargo bay. That was where she went. The first casualties arrived 20 minutes after Corvith's team hit the ground. Drelith warriors carried on stretchers, their beautiful crystalline armor cracked and shattered, leaking pale blue fluid from wounds that steamed in the cold air. The medics moved fast, but there were too many wounded and not enough hands. Field medic Dranix saw Mara first. "No," she said immediately, pointing one long armored finger toward the door. "You go back. Right now, this is not a place for you." Mara ignored her completely. She had watched the medics work before during training drills and minor injuries. She knew where the supply crates were stored. She knew which colored containers held wound sealant and which held pain suppressors. She knew that the medics needed clean instruments passed to them quickly, because stopping to retrieve tools cost seconds that bleeding soldiers did not have. She grabbed a tray of sterile instruments and brought it to the nearest medic before Dranix could stop her. The medic looked down at her, looked at the perfectly organized tray, and took the instruments without a word. Dranix opened her mouth to protest, but another shuttle arrived, with 6 more wounded, and suddenly there was no time to argue about anything. Mara worked. She ran supplies from crate to table, held pressure bandages against wounds with her small hands, passed tools, cleared debris, and stayed out of the way when she needed to. She was too short to reach the operating surfaces, so she climbed on equipment crates and worked from there. She was not strong enough to carry a wounded Drelith warrior. She was not tall enough to operate the surgical machines. She was not trained enough to treat a single injury on her own. But she had 2 free hands, and she was fast, and she did not stop, and that was enough. For 2 hours, she worked alongside the medical team, and no one told her to leave again, because no one can afford to lose even 1 pair of hands, no matter how small. Then the Voss came aboard. The breach alarm screamed through the ship like a living thing, and Mara felt the deck shudder beneath her feet, as something massive slammed into the Thornmantle's hull. The Voss had launched boarding pods, 6 of them, punching through the ship's armor like claws through flesh. 2 of them hit near the medical bay. The doors exploded inward. Mara had never seen a Voss warrior up close. She had seen images in Thesic's files, clinical photographs, and anatomical diagrams that presented them as large reptilian predators with natural armor and impressive claw structures. The files had not prepared her for the reality. They were enormous. Each one stood nearly 4 meters tall, covered in scales the color of dried blood, with arms that ended in hands that were more like industrial cutting tools. Their eyes were yellow and slitted, and filled with the flat, empty hunger of a species that had evolved as apex predators, and had never learned to be anything else. 6 of them poured into the medical bay. Dranix grabbed a weapon. The 2 guards at the door opened fire. One of them died immediately, his chest caved in by a single swipe of a Voss claw. The other managed to wound one of the attackers, before being thrown across the room like a discarded tool. Dranix fired 3 shots, dropped 1 Voss, and then took a hit to her side that sent her spinning into a row of medical equipment. 5 Voss remained. They spread through the medical bay, killing wounded soldiers who could not defend themselves, smashing equipment, and roaring in their guttural language. One of them found Mara. She was crouched behind an overturned supply crate, not hiding exactly, but waiting, her body coiled tight, and her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her teeth. The Voss warrior looked down at her and stopped. It had never seen anything like her. She was absurdly small compared to everything else on this ship, soft and pale, and trembling with huge brown eyes that stared up at the massive predator with an expression the Voss could not read. It tilted its enormous head and made a sound that might have been laughter. Then it reached for her with one clawed hand, clearly intending to swat her aside like an insect. Mara did not run. She had spent 6 months on this ship, watching everything, learning everything, filing away every piece of information that passed before her eyes. She had watched Thesic examine captured Voss specimens. She had studied their anatomy on his data screens when he thought she was sleeping. She knew their armor plating was nearly impenetrable. She also knew that the scales along the inner joint of their arms, where the limb met the torso, were thinner and softer because the joint needed flexibility to function. The Voss reached for her, and she lunged, not away from. She jumped at the arm coming toward her, grabbed onto the rough scales with both hands, pulled herself up with the desperate strength of a creature that had been climbing things since she could walk, and she bit down on the soft tissue of the inner arm joint. She bit with everything she had. Her teeth were small and flat, designed by evolution for tearing cooked meat and crushing grain, not for combat against armored reptilian giants. But the inner joint was soft, and her jaw muscles were driven by a flood of adrenaline so powerful that Thesic's remote sensors would later show readings he initially assumed were instrument errors. She broke skin. She tasted blood, hot and bitter and wrong, and her stomach immediately revolted because Voss blood was toxic to nearly every known species. But she did not let go. Her body screamed at her to release. Spit, to flee, and she did not let go because letting go meant dying, and something deep inside her, something older than thought, had decided that she was not going to die today. The Voss warrior screamed. It was a sound of pure shock more than pain, because pain from a creature this small should have been impossible. The warrior thrashed its arm trying to dislodge her, and Mara held on, her small body whipping back and forth like a flag in a storm, her teeth grinding deeper into flesh that burned her mouth and made her eyes water. 3 seconds, that was all she bought. 3 seconds of chaos and confusion and a 12-foot predator screaming because something the size of its hand had decided to fight back. 3 seconds was enough. Dranix had dragged herself to a fallen guard's weapon. She raised it with shaking arms, aimed at the distracted Voss, and fired. The shot took the warrior through the throat, and it collapsed forward, nearly crushing Mara beneath it. She rolled free at the last moment, vomiting Voss blood onto the deck, shaking so hard her vision blurred. The remaining 4 Voss hesitated. They had just watched one of their own brought down by a sequence of events that began with the smallest creature in the room attacking it. That hesitation cost them 2 more seconds, and in those 2 seconds, the ship's internal security team arrived and filled the medical bay with weapons fire. It was over in moments. Mara lay on the deck, curled into a ball, poisoned and bleeding from her mouth, where the toxic blood had blistered her gums. Her body shook with the aftermath of an adrenaline surge that had pushed her small frame far past its design limits. Dranix crawled to her and gathered her up with surprising gentleness for a Drelith. "Stupid," Dranix whispered. "Stupid, brave, horrible little creature." Mara vomited again, and then, incredibly, smiled. The story spread through the Thorn Mantle within hours. Small One had attacked a Voss warrior. The soft little alien that half the crew still considered a pet had drawn blood from a species that Drelith soldiers feared. Warriors who had never given Mara a second glance now watched her pass through the corridors with something new in their compound eyes. Not affection exactly, but recognition. The look one fighter gives another after seeing them stand their ground. On the surface of Keth Vorin, the battle turned. Commander Sithara had been struggling against the Voss defensive positions, heavily fortified lines that her forces could not breach directly. Then she remembered something Mara had done weeks earlier, escaping her quarters not by attacking the lock, but by removing the pins from the door hinges. "She never attacks the strongest point," Sithara murmured. Then she ordered her forces to ignore the Voss front line entirely, and strike at the supply structures behind them. The Voss formation collapsed in under an hour. Evening. Thesic updated his file on human biology. He deleted the word weak from 17 separate entries. He added a new note at the top of the document, flagged with the highest priority marker his system allowed. Threat reassessment. Extreme. Species does not avoid pain, but weaponizes it. Adrenaline response is not a fear mechanism, but a combat activation system. The specimen did not attack despite being afraid. She attacked because she was afraid. Fear makes them more dangerous, not less. Do not underestimate. Recommend immediate reclassification. He saved the file and sat in the dark for a long time. In the medical bay, Commander Sithara stood over the small human child who lay sleeping on a cot that was still too big for her. The blisters in her mouth had been treated, and her vital signs had stabilized. She looked impossibly small and impossibly fragile, and she had a Voss warrior's blood still crusted under her fingernails. "What is your name?" Sithara asked, quietly. "Your real name, not the number we gave you." Mara opened her eyes. She thought for a long time, because the truth was that she had begun to forget. She reached back through months of alien sounds and alien faces, to a time before the ship, before the cold pod, before the darkness. A woman's voice sang a word that meant her. "Mara," she whispered. Sithara repeated it, testing the strange soft sound against her mandibles. Then she did something that made every Drelith in the room stop breathing. She lowered her great armored head, the gesture of respect given only to equals, only to those who had proven their worth in battle. "Mara," she said, "you are no specimen. You are something we do not have a word for." Mara looked up at the towering insectoid commander who had once ordered her disposed of, and she grinned, with blistered lips and blood-stained teeth. She was 4 years old, and she had already started a legend. Mara was 9 years old now, and she had grown in ways that surprised everyone, including herself. She was taller, of course, though still absurdly short by Drelith standards, barely reaching the midsection of most adults on the ship. She was stronger, too, her muscles dense and efficient, from years of living in gravity that was 30% heavier than what her bones had been built for. She moved through the corridors of the Thornmantle with the easy confidence of someone who knew every access tunnel, every shortcut, every blind spot in the security system. She spoke 4 languages fluently. Drelith was her primary tongue now, spoken with an accent that the crew found endlessly amusing, The clicks and resonance tones filtered through a soft human throat that was never meant to produce them. She had also learned Voss from interrogation recordings, trade common from the merchant ships that sometimes docked with the fleet, and a rough, functional version of Fesic's scientific dialect that she used specifically to annoy him during their daily study sessions. She could fight not well by Draelith's standards, because she would never have the mass or the natural armor for their style of combat. But Corvith had taught her the principles of Draelith warfare, the breathing patterns, the tactical thinking, the ability to read an opponent's intentions before they moved. She had taken those principles and twisted them into something new, a style that relied on speed and unpredictability, and a willingness to accept injury that no Draelith could match. Corvith had sparred with her last week. She had lost, of course, because she always lost in direct physical confrontation, but she had maneuvered him into a position where winning cost him a simulated injury to his primary leg joint, a trade that in real combat would have crippled him and left her free to escape. He had stared at her afterward with an expression she could not read, and then he had bowed his head the way Scythara had done years ago. She had beaten him in tactical simulations twice. She did not let him forget it. But for all of this, for all the languages and the fighting and the adaptation, Mara was lonely. She felt it most at night, when the ship went quiet, and the hum of the engines was the only sound. She would lie in her quarters, which Corvith had long ago converted from a containment cell into something approaching a real room, and she would stare at the ceiling and try to remember. She remembered fire. She remembered a sound like the world tearing apart. She remembered cold, terrible cold, and then nothing until she woke up and saw Corvith's face for the first time. She remembered a voice, a woman's voice, warm and desperate, saying words she could no longer understand, in a language she was forgetting more of every day. She was not Draelith. She knew that. She would never be Draelith, no matter how well she spoke their language or fought in their style, navigated their world. She was something else, something from somewhere else, and she did not know where. She wanted to find out. The opportunity came wrapped in a Voss intelligence transmission that Draelith signals officers intercepted on a routine sweep. The message was encrypted, but Draelith codebreakers had long since cracked the Voss communication protocols. What they found inside made Commander Scythara summon her entire senior staff to the bridge. The Voss had encountered another human vessel, not a colony ship this time, not a fragile transport full of sleeping civilians drifting through space like a seed on the wind. This was something else entirely. The Voss patrol fleet that found it had followed standard protocol, broadcasting an intimidation signal that essentially translated to surrender or be destroyed. The human vessel did not surrender. It did not run. It did not negotiate or plead or attempt to communicate. It opened fire. Lasted 11 minutes. The Voss lost 9 ships. The human vessel, later identified through intercepted communications as the UNS Retribution, a destroyer-class warship belonging to something called the United Nations Space Command, sustained what its crew apparently described as minor hull scoring, and continued on its original heading without stopping. 9 ships in 11 minutes, and the humans had not even slowed down. The bridge was silent as Scythara finished the briefing. Mara stood at the back of the room, where Corvith had brought her, because he had learned years ago that keeping her out of important meetings was more trouble than it was worth. She listened to the report, and felt something crack open inside her chest, something that had been locked away since she was 4 years old. There were others. There were more of her kind, and they were not weak. They were not fragile little specimens catalogued and pitied by aliens who thought they knew what strength looked like. They had teeth. Fesic presented his research to the Draelith High Council via secure transmission. The same research he had been compiling for 5 years, updated now with the terrifying context of the Retribution's combat performance. He stood before the holographic assembly of the most powerful figures in the hegemony, and told them what he had told Corvith years ago. Except now, he had the evidence to make them listen. "Humans are not a mistake," he said. "They are the opposite. They are a species forged on what I can only classify as a death world, a planet of extreme weather, active geological violence, predatory megafauna, toxic flora, and a biosphere so aggressively competitive that simply surviving childhood is a statistical achievement. They did not evolve to dominate a single environment. They evolved to endure all environments. They adapt. They persist. They break, and they heal, and they come back stronger and angrier than before." He paused and let his words land. Words settle over the council like falling ash. "And they are very, very angry about what happened to the Avalon's promise." That was the part that made the council listen. The colony ship that Scythara's fleet had found destroyed in the debris field had not been forgotten by the humans. Intercepted communications revealed that the UNSC had launched a full investigation into the ship's disappearance. And that investigation had led them to this region of space. They were not here by accident. They were looking for their dead. And they were finding Drylith and Voss instead. Scythara proposed her plan with the blunt efficiency of a commander who had no patience for politics. "We have something they want," she said. "We have one of their children. We raised her, we protected her, we did not harm her. If we return Mara to her people, we demonstrate good faith. If we forge an alliance with this species, we gain the most dangerous ally in the known galaxy. If we do nothing, they will eventually find us anyway, and they will not ask questions first." The council debated for 6 hours. Mara was not present for the debate, but Corvith told her afterward that it was the most heated argument the council had seen in a generation. Half of them wanted to hide, to avoid contact with this terrifyingly resilient species entirely. The other half recognized what Scythara had understood immediately, that hiding from humans was not a long-term strategy, because humans apparently did not stop looking for things they had lost. The vote passed by a narrow margin. Mara would be sent as an envoy. She accepted, not because she cared about politics or alliances or the strategic future of the Drylith hegemony. She accepted because somewhere out there, in ships that could tear through Voss fleets like paper, were people who looked like her. People who might remember the woman whose voice she could no longer quite hear. The Thornmantle changed. It took them 3 weeks to reach the coordinates of the last confirmed human sighting. Mara spent those weeks in a state of restless anticipation that drove the crew slightly insane. She could not sit still. She could not sleep. She paced the corridors at all hours, ran combat drills until her muscles screamed, and spent long hours staring out the observation deck, at the stars rushing past as if she could will them to move faster. Corvith found her there on the final night before contact. "Are you afraid?" he asked. She thought about it. "Yes," she said, "but not of them. I am afraid they will not want me. I am afraid I have been gone too long. I am afraid I am more Drylith than human now, and they will look at me and see a stranger." Corvith sat down beside her, his massive frame folding awkwardly to reach her level. "You are not Drylith," he said. "You never were. You are something that walked into our world and refused to be broken by it. Whoever your people are, they should be proud." Mara leaned against his armored side, the chitin warm from the ship's internal heating, and she closed her eyes. The next morning, the Thornmantle dropped out of faster-than-light travel, and immediately detected 3 vessels on an intercept course. Each one was enormous, dwarfing the Thornmantle, the way the Thornmantle dwarfed its own shuttles. They were built with a brutal efficiency that even Scythara respected, all heavy armor and weapons arrays, with none of the elegant aesthetic that Drylith shipbuilders favored. These were not ships designed to impress. They were ships designed to win. A transmission cut through the bridge speakers, spoken in Drelith, but with a strange flat accent that no one on the Thornmantle had ever heard before. Drelith vessel, you are carrying a human life sign. Explain immediately, or we will open fire. You have 30 seconds. The bridge erupted, 20 officers shouting at once, stations lighting up, weapon systems activating on reflex. Cythara opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, a small figure pushed past her and grabbed the communications console. Mara's hands were shaking. Her heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. She had not spoken English in 5 years. She had not even thought in English in 5 years. The words felt like stones in her mouth, heavy and foreign and achingly familiar all at once. She pressed the transmit button, and she said one word. Wait. The silence that followed lasted an eternity. The human ships did not fire. For 12 terrible seconds, the weapons arrays of 3 warships held their aim on the Thornmantle, and every Drelith on the bridge understood that they were one word away from becoming dust. Then, a voice came back through the speakers, different from the first, softer and shaking with something that Mara had almost forgotten how to recognize. Say again, unidentified speaker, say again, please. Mara gripped the communications console so hard her knuckles turned white. She searched for words she had not used since she was 4, words that felt like ghosts in her mouth, the language of lullabies and bedtime stories, and a woman's voice telling her to be brave. My name is Mara, she said in English that cracked and stumbled and sounded wrong even to her own ears. I was on the Avalon's Promise. I have been here a long time. Please do not shoot. They saved me. The silence that followed was so complete that Mara could hear her own blood rushing in her ears. Then the voice on the other end made a sound that she did not immediately understand, because she had not heard a human cry in 5 years. They were brought aboard the flagship, the UNS Constellation, under conditions that Commander Cythara found deeply uncomfortable. A Drelith honor guard would have met foreign dignitaries with weapons sheathed and formation precise. The humans sent 200 armed Marines in full combat armor, who lined the docking corridor like walls of metal and fury, and stared at Corvith and Cythara with eyes that held no welcome at all. Mara walked between her 2 worlds, Corvith on her left, towering and rigid, his chitin dimmed with anxiety he would never admit. Cythara on her right, proud and straight-backed, refusing to show a single tremor of unease before an alien species, even one that could apparently destroy her ship without breaking stride. And ahead of them, at the end of the corridor, stood the first humans Mara had seen since she was pulled from a cryopod on a dead ship. They were small. That was her first thought, and it almost made her laugh, because she had spent 5 years surrounded by beings that stood 3 meters tall and weighed half a ton, and she had forgotten that her own species was compact and soft, and eye-level with each other. The humans ahead of her were barely taller than she would be in a few years. Their skin was different shades of brown and pink and tan. Their eyes were wide and wet, and fixed on her with an intensity that she felt in her bones. A woman in a dark uniform stepped forward. She had silver hair, and lines on her face that spoke of years spent carrying burdens too heavy for one person. She looked at Mara, and her composure cracked down the middle like ice breaking in spring. Mara Vasquez, she said, and her voice trembled. Daughter of Elena and David Vasquez, passenger manifest of the colony ship Avalon's Promise, listed as deceased. Parents' names spoken aloud for the first time in 5 years, and the sound hit her like a physical blow. She had not known their names. She had forgotten. She had been 4 years old, and she had forgotten her own parents' names, and now a stranger was giving them back to her, and she could not breathe. They are dead, Mara said. It was not a question. She had always known. She had known since she woke up in the cold and the dark, and no one came for her. Yes, the woman said gently. They died making sure you reached that cryopod. Your mother carried you through the fire. Your father held the door. Mara did not cry. She had learned from the Drelith that tears were a private thing, something you kept inside and carried with you. But her eyes burned, and her throat closed, and she stood very still for a long time. Behind her, Corvith watched the humans, and understood something that changed everything for him. These creatures were weeping. Hardened soldiers in full combat armor, all of them, crying, carrying weapons that could level cities, were openly crying over the survival of a single child. They were not trying to hide it. They were not ashamed of it. They felt everything, every loss and every miracle, and they carried it all, right on the surface, where anyone could see. This is why they are dangerous, Corvith thought. Not because they are strong, but because they care so much about each other, that hurting one of them means fighting all of them. Sithara understood it too. She watched the human admiral, a broad-shouldered man named Chen, who had the calm, steady presence of someone accustomed to deciding whether entire fleets lived or died. She watched him look at Mara, and she saw something in his expression that transcended species, the raw, protective fury of someone looking at a child who should have been safe and was not. You kept her alive, Admiral Chen said to Sithara. It was not a question. She kept herself alive, Sithara replied. We merely provided the something shifted in the Admiral's eyes. A fraction of the cold suspicion melted away, replaced by something that on a Drelith face would have been called the recognition of truth. The negotiations took 2 weeks. They were complicated by the fact that the Drelith and humans had no common cultural framework, no shared history, no basis for trust beyond a single small girl who stood between them and translated not just their words, but their intentions. She explained Drelith honor codes to human diplomats, who found them rigid and strange. She explained human emotional expression to Drelith commanders, who found it terrifying and excessive. She told both sides the same thing over and over in different words, until they heard it. They are not like you. They will never be like you. But they are not your enemy. She stood before the human admiralty on the 4th day and spoke in English that grew more fluid with every hour, the language flooding back like water, filling a dry riverbed. She told them about Corvith and the right of found burden, about how a young soldier had defied his commander to save something small and helpless, because an ancient code told him it was the right thing to do. She told them about Fesic, who had called her species a mistake, and then spent 5 years trying to understand her with a dedication that bordered on obsession. She told them about Dranix, who had cursed her for being in the medical bay, and then nearly died to protect her. She told them about Sithara, who had ordered her disposed of, and then bowed her head to a 4-year-old girl who bit a Voss warrior. They called me a mistake, Mara said, an evolutionary accident, a creature that should never have made it past the food chain on its homeworld. They measured every weakness I had, and they documented them all in very detailed files. She paused and smiled, and then they watched me prove them wrong every single day. They could have thrown me out an airlock, raised me instead. She looked at both sides of the table. You do not have to like each other. You do not have to understand each other. You just have to decide that the alternative is worse. The treaty was signed on the 11th day. They called it the Mara Accords, the first agreement between humanity and an alien civilization, forged not through strength or threats or political maneuvering, but through the testimony of a 9-year-old girl who belonged to both worlds and neither. The terms were straightforward: mutual defense, open communication, shared intelligence on the Voss threat, and a formal recognition that the destruction of the Avalon's promise had been an accident of war, not an act of aggression. When word reached the Voss Concordance that the soft-skinned nightmare species and the crystal-shelled Drelith had formed an alliance, the Voss High Predator did something unprecedented in the entire history of the Concordance. He sued for peace. War ended not with a final battle, but with a document, signed by 3 species who had spent years killing each other, and who now, through a chain of events that began with one young officer refusing to leave a crying child in the wreckage, chose to stop. Thesic published his book 6 months later. It was titled The Mistake of Life, and it became the most widely read xenobiological study in Drelith history, not because of its scientific rigor, although Thesic would insist that the rigor was impeccable, but because of its conclusion. The final pages of the book, written in Thesic's precise clinical style, said this: "I spent years studying a single human child. I catalogued every weakness, every fragility, every biological disadvantage. I filled hundreds of reports, explaining why this species should not exist, and I was correct. By every metric we use to measure survival fitness, humans should not exist. They are too soft, too slow, too breakable. They exist because they refuse not to. They look at a universe that was never designed for them, and they do not care. They bleed, and they keep going. They break, and they heal. They lose everything, and they build it again. They are not strong in the way we understand strength. They are something else entirely. They are stubborn. I called them a mistake. I was wrong. They are not a mistake. They are the answer to a question the universe never thought to ask. What happens when something too weak to survive simply decides that it will?" Mara read the book in one sitting. She laughed until she cried, which confused Thesic enormously. Then she threw her arms around him in a gesture he had no cultural framework for, but endured with the stiff dignity of a scientist who had long since accepted that his research subject was completely beyond his control. "Thank you," she said into his chitin. "That is the best compliment my species has ever received." "Compliment," Thesic said. "It was a scientific assessment." "I know," she said. "That is what makes it perfect." On the day the Thornmantle officially received its new designation as the first joint human-Drelith liaison vessel, Mara stood on the bridge. She was 9 years old. She was fluent in 5 languages. She had scars on her hands and blisters that had healed into calluses, and she smiled with teeth that had once drawn blood from a creature 10 times her size. Corvith stood on her left, her guardian, her protector, the first person who had ever looked at her and seen something worth saving. On her right stood Lieutenant Commander Reyes, the human marine assigned as her UNSC security liaison, who had taken one look at Mara's service record and told her that she was the most terrifying 9-year-old he had ever met. Behind her stood the bridge crew of the Thornmantle, Drelith warriors who had watched a helpless alien child grow into something none of them had ever imagined. And beyond the viewport, the stars stretched out in every direction, infinite and cold, and utterly indifferent to the small, fierce creature standing at the intersection of 2 civilizations. Mara Vasquez, the mistake of life. She was just getting started.